I remember clearly that the right side of his face was tilted upward. His eyes were fixed, unmoving. There was a visible opening in his skull, and through it I could see that there was no brain matter left. It had all been blown away. We were uneasy about the situation, but at the same time, we understood that we didn't really have a choice. The trip to Texas had a very specific purpose: to give President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy as much visibility as possible. They wanted people to feel close to them, to see them up close without any barriers. That's why the decision was made to use open cars everywhere we went. The agents were even instructed to keep their distance as much as possible. Of course, there were moments when I had to move in closer, but that was only when circumstances forced it. Under normal conditions, we stayed back so the president and his wife could appear approachable, like they were simply among the people, not separated from them. In the presidential car, it was the president and Mrs. Kennedy, along with Governor Connolly and his wife. I was positioned in the car directly behind them, the follow-up car. We maintained a very tight distance, about 3 to 5 feet at all times, regardless of speed. I stood on the left side, on the running board of that car, which was also open. There were 8 agents in total, along with 2 members of the president's staff: Kenny O'Donnell, his chief of staff, and Dave Powers, his personal assistant. As we approached an area known as Dealey Plaza, I was scanning everything around me. The setting was more open, with a grassy area, and the crowds had started to thin out compared to earlier parts of the route through Dallas. It felt like we were nearing the end of the motorcade, preparing to merge onto an expressway that would take the president to the Trade Mart for his speech. Ahead, there was an overpass we were about to pass under. I noticed police officers stationed on top, which gave me some reassurance. Still, throughout the city, we had seen people everywhere, leaning out of windows, standing on fire escapes, gathering on rooftops, anywhere they could get a better view. The same was true for the building at the corner of Houston and Elm Street, the Texas School Book Depository. Several windows were open, maybe 4 or 5, and I could see a few workers sitting along a ledge, likely on their lunch break, watching the motorcade pass by. We had just turned onto Elm Street and moved forward about 150 feet when, as I was looking to my left, I suddenly heard a sharp, explosive sound coming from behind me, over my right shoulder. At first, I didn't register it as a gunshot. I began turning toward the sound, but before I could fully react, my attention shifted to the president's car. I saw his immediate reaction. That's when it hit me that it was gunfire. He brought his hands up toward his throat and began leaning to his left. Because he was wearing a back brace, he couldn't bend forward easily. In front of him, Governor Connolly was seated in a jump seat, positioned very close, almost against the president's knees. As the realization set in, I jumped from my position and ran toward the presidential car. My goal was to climb onto the back and shield the president and Mrs. Kennedy. To get there, I had to squeeze between a motorcycle officer and the car I had been riding on. There was engine noise all around, and I later learned that a second shot had been fired during that moment, but I never heard it myself. As I got closer, just as I was reaching the car, another shot rang out. This one I heard and felt. By that point, the president had slumped further to his left, his head lowered significantly. The bullet struck the back of his head and violently exited through the upper right side, just above the ear. The impact was devastating, and in that instant, everything changed. A section of his skull had been torn open, but part of it was still attached to the scalp, hanging forward like a loose flap. From that wound, blood, bone fragments, and brain matter burst outward, covering the back of the car, splashing onto me, and even onto Mrs. Kennedy. As I moved to climb onto the car, Mrs. Kennedy had already climbed onto the trunk. She was reaching for what had been blown from the president's head, trying to gather it in her hands. She actually managed to pick some of it up. I quickly reached her, grabbed her, and guided her back into the rear seat. As I did that, the president's body slumped over to his left and fell into her lap. His face was turned upward on the right side. His eyes were still, completely fixed. There was a visible opening in his skull, and I could clearly see that there was nothing left inside. It had all been blown out. In that moment, I believed he was gone. There was no doubt in my mind that he had died. I turned toward the agents in the car behind us and gave them a thumbs-down signal. They hadn't been able to react in time the way I had. When the first sound rang out, they turned toward it, but that movement actually took their attention away from the president at the exact moment the fatal shot was fired. By the time they turned back, I was already on the car. There was nothing they could have done. Without hesitation, I shouted at the driver to get us to a hospital immediately. At the same time, the agent sitting in the front passenger seat also ordered the driver to accelerate and get out of the area. That was our protocol: leave the scene as quickly as possible. We didn't know Dallas very well, so Police Chief Curry took the lead in his vehicle and guided us to Parkland Hospital. The drive lasted only about 4 minutes, but we were moving at around 70 miles per hour along the Stemmons Freeway. During that time, I positioned myself on top of the back seat, bracing my body to avoid being thrown off as the car sped and turned. I hooked one leg onto the right side and gripped the left side tightly with my hands, trying to keep myself steady as we rushed forward. Inside the car, there was an eerie silence at first. No one spoke. Then Mrs. Kennedy began to say a few words. Her voice was filled with shock and heartbreak. She said that they had shot his head, that she was holding pieces of him in her hand, and that she loved him. After that, she said nothing more. We arrived at the hospital quickly. The staff had been alerted that we were coming, but when we pulled up, there was no one waiting outside. One of the agents from the lead car jumped out and ran inside. He found an attendant struggling to push 2 stretchers through a doorway at the same time. They were stuck, so the agent grabbed one and brought it out himself, and the attendant followed with the other. Because of how the car was arranged, we had to remove Governor Connolly first before we could reach the president. They lifted the governor onto a stretcher and rushed him into the emergency room. Then we turned our attention to the president. We needed to move him onto a stretcher, but Mrs. Kennedy was holding onto him tightly. She wouldn't let go. I leaned in and gently urged her, asking her to let us help him. There was no response. I tried again, but she still didn't react. Then it became clear to me what was happening. I had spent over 3 years around her. I knew her well enough to understand. She didn't want anyone to see him in the condition he was in. It was devastating, far beyond anything anyone should have to witness. I took off my suit jacket and gently placed it over his head and upper back, covering the wounds. The moment I did that, Mrs. Kennedy finally released her hold. We carefully lifted him from the car, placed him onto a stretcher, and rushed him inside the hospital, straight into Trauma Room 1. After that, I stayed with her. I didn't leave her side. My assistant remained close to her as well, making sure she wasn't alone in that moment. Not long after, my supervisor instructed me to establish a direct phone line to the White House in Washington. I asked the hospital staff if I could use one of their phones, and they quickly provided one. In Dallas, we had a White House communications setup already in place, so I contacted the switchboard there and told them to connect me immediately to Washington and keep the line open. Once the connection was made, I began briefing my supervisor on everything that had happened. While I was speaking, the operator interrupted and said that the Attorney General wanted to talk to me. That was Robert Kennedy, the president's brother. He came on the line and asked me what was happening. I told him there had been a shooting, that the president had been hit, and that Governor Connolly had also been wounded. I explained that we were at the hospital and that the doctors were doing everything they could. Then he asked me how serious it was. I couldn't bring myself to tell him directly that his brother was gone, so instead, I told him it was as bad as it could possibly be. After that, he said nothing more and hung up. At around 1 o'clock, one of the doctors stepped out of the trauma room. He looked at us and said quietly that there was nothing more they could do. The president was gone. Right after that, the chief of staff approached me and said they wanted to return the president's body to Washington. He asked if I could arrange for a casket. I immediately contacted the hospital administration, and they connected me with a local mortuary. We placed the order, and the casket was delivered to the hospital without delay. They began preparing the president's body to be placed inside when a local coroner entered the room. He questioned what we were doing. We explained that we were preparing to transport the body back to Washington. He stopped us and said that wasn't allowed. He told us that under Texas law, in a homicide case, the body had to undergo an autopsy before it could be released. We asked how long that process would take. His answer was uncertain. He said it could take an hour, maybe 2, or even longer. That wasn't something we could accept. After some discussion, an agreement was reached. We would be allowed to take the president's body, but only if a qualified medical doctor accompanied it the entire time. I suggested Admiral George Berkeley, the president's military physician, who was already present. He agreed, and he stayed with the body continuously, all the way through the eventual autopsy. The shooting had taken place around 12:30 in the afternoon. The doctors in the trauma room realized almost immediately that there was nothing they could do. They didn't even turn his body over. They examined him only from the front and didn't initially see the full extent of the injuries. There were 2 gunshot wounds from behind. One entered near the upper back, around the neck area, and exited near the knot of his tie, even damaging it slightly. The second entered low at the back of his head and exited above the ear. That was the wound they noticed right away. There was no brain matter visible, and his eyes were fixed. When we first brought him into the emergency room, there were faint signs of breathing, likely just reflexive, involuntary movement. It didn't last. There was no measurable blood pressure. Later, I was asked if I accompanied Mrs. Kennedy on the flight back to Washington. I did. Once we received permission to move the body, we carried the casket out to the waiting ambulance. Admiral Berkeley climbed into the back to remain with the president, ensuring he was not left alone at any point during the journey. Admiral Berkeley climbed into the back of the ambulance with the casket. I suggested to Mrs. Kennedy that we should ride in a separate car, but she refused. She looked at me and said she was going to stay with the president. There was no hesitation in her voice. So I opened the door, she got in, and I followed. The 3 of us were in the back together, riding alongside the casket as we made our way to Love Field. It was a quiet, heavy ride. When we arrived, the agents I was working with and I carried the casket up the stairs toward the rear entrance of Air Force One. But when we reached the door, we realized the casket was slightly too wide to fit through because of the handles. We didn't have time to figure out another way, so we had to remove the handles right there in order to get it inside. Inside the aircraft, the Air Force One engineers had already cleared out a section in the rear. They had removed several seats so the casket could be placed properly in the cabin, instead of being stored below. As we prepared for departure, Vice President Johnson and his wife were also on board. He had been in communication with Washington and was advised that he needed to take the oath of office immediately, while still in Dallas. That meant we needed a federal judge. After some effort, we located Judge Sarah Hughes, who had recently been appointed, and brought her onto the plane. She was ready to administer the oath. Just before the ceremony began, I was in the front section of the plane when I received word that Mrs. Kennedy wanted to see me. I walked back to where she was standing near the casket. She stood up, took my hand, and asked me quietly what was going to happen to me now. Even in that moment, after everything she had just been through, she was thinking about us, the agents, and how we were holding up. She knew how much we cared about the president. I reassured her that I would be all right. Soon after that, the swearing-in took place. She chose to stand beside Vice President Johnson as he took the oath and became President of the United States. She was still wearing the same clothes, refusing to change. She said she wanted the world to see what had been done. In the days that followed, everything moved quickly, yet it all felt heavy. After returning to Washington, the casket was brought to the White House, where it remained until the 24th. Then it was moved to the U.S. Capitol and placed in state. An overwhelming number of people came to pay their respects. The lines stretched endlessly, and people were allowed to pass by both day and night. On Monday, the 25th, the official funeral took place. The casket was carried from the Capitol and returned briefly to the White House before the procession began. Leaders from all over the world had arrived, heads of state and government, figures of immense global importance. There were so many that it was difficult to take it all in. Mrs. Kennedy then made the decision to walk from that point to St. Matthew's Cathedral. Because she walked, all of those world leaders walked with her. It created an enormous security challenge, but no one questioned it. Together, they moved slowly along Pennsylvania Avenue toward the cathedral. At that time, she was not immediately aware that Oswald had been killed. The timing of it all meant she only learned about it later. And as far as I know, she never expressed any direct reaction to it, at least not in my presence. Looking back, I believe that his death left many unanswered questions. Because he was never fully interrogated, because we never heard directly from him about his motives, it opened the door to endless speculation. Over the years, I've heard countless theories. New ones seem to appear all the time. But in the end, they remain just that, ideas without proof, not established facts. What stays with me most is not just the sequence of events, but the weight of what everyone carried in those moments. There was no time to process anything. Everything moved forward with urgency, decisions made in seconds, actions taken on instinct and training. Yet underneath all of that, there was a quiet understanding among us that nothing would ever be the same again. Even in the middle of chaos, there was a sense of duty that didn't allow anyone to stop. Every step, from the hospital to the flight, from Washington to the funeral, was handled with precision, but also with a deep sense of loss that no one could really put into words. You could see it in the faces of the agents, the staff, the people lining the streets. It wasn't just the loss of a leader, it felt personal to everyone. Mrs. Kennedy's strength during those days stood out in a way that's hard to explain. She was composed, but not distant. She carried her grief in full view of the world, yet never allowed it to break her sense of purpose. The choices she made, the way she carried herself, even the decision to walk during the procession, all of it reflected something deeper than sorrow. It was as if she understood that the moment would be remembered forever, and she wanted it to reflect dignity, truth, and reality. For those of us who were there, the memories didn't fade. The sounds, the images, the urgency, they stayed. Not as something dramatic, but as something heavy and real. It became part of who we were after that day. And even years later, when people ask questions or try to understand what happened, there's always that gap between what can be explained and what was actually felt in those moments. In the end, history records the facts, the timelines, and the outcomes. But what it doesn't fully capture is the human side of it all. The shock, the silence, the sense of disbelief, and the quiet strength that carried everyone through one of the most difficult days anyone could ever witness. As time went on, the moments from that day didn't become easier to think about. They simply became more deeply ingrained. It wasn't something you could leave behind. Every detail had a way of replaying itself, not always in full, but in fragments. A sound, a movement, a single image could bring it all back instantly. There was also a growing awareness of how the world outside was reacting. People weren't just mourning, they were searching for answers, trying to make sense of something that felt impossible to accept. And in that search, questions turned into theories, and theories multiplied over time. From where I stood, having witnessed it all unfold so closely, it was clear how much of what people imagined was shaped by what they didn't see or couldn't know. What made it even more difficult was the feeling that no explanation would ever feel complete enough. Even when facts were presented, even when investigations were carried out, there was always a sense that something was missing. Not necessarily in evidence, but in understanding. Because what happened that day wasn't just an event, it was a moment that shook people emotionally. And emotions don't settle as easily as facts. For those directly involved, the responsibility didn't end when the day was over. There was reflection, there was questioning, and there was a quiet burden that came with having been there. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that stayed personal. You think about what could have been different, even when you know the reality of how quickly everything happened. And yet, through all of it, there was also a recognition of the resilience that followed. The country moved forward, leadership transitioned, and life continued, even though it carried a scar. That contrast between loss and continuation is what made the entire experience feel so profound. Looking back, it's not just about remembering what happened, but understanding how deeply it affected everyone who witnessed it, directly or from afar. It changed perspectives, it reshaped trust, and it left behind a legacy that goes beyond the moment itself. It became a part of history, but for those who lived it, it remains something far more personal than history could ever fully describe. It wasn't just a moment of tragedy. It was a moment that changed history forever. What unfolded that day revealed not only the fragility of life, but also the strength, loyalty, and humanity of those who stood closest to it. Amid chaos, duty never wavered, and even in unbearable loss, dignity was preserved. The questions may never fully fade, but the memory of that day remains a powerful reminder of sacrifice, courage, and the cost of leadership.